lots of music, lots of stuff. But if you didn't know George Harrison's story, there were places where you could quickly become lost. And like, why are they talking about this? Why are they in Hamburg? Who's that woman? You know, it's like you don't know. So very clearly they decided that their most specific audience were Beatles lovers, music lovers, who would know a lot of that story to give the context. That's again the cultural kind of thing. Is if you were in a very stable society that speaks the same languages, has the same myths, you don't have to explain as much in your stories because people share different things. Anyway, the story, we'll go back to that again. Story is really important to find something that is going to carry your passion and is going to engage people. What we do when we find a story that we decide we're going to devote to, and I'm talking about my producing partner Miranda and I, we first do a tremendous amount of research on it. This is research of all different kinds. We did a film a long time ago on organic farming. I was living in New York City at the time. No idea. So I had to go out and do a tremendous amount of research on agronomy, on agriculture, go look at farms, different kinds of farms, try to understand soil science, try to understand the weather cycle, geology, you know, on and on and on and on. Though I never grew a piece of food in my life, I still had to find this out. Then the other thing would be to go and to say, okay, I'm going to do a film on farming. I need to go look and see what other people have done on that. It's in film, basically. So go out, find the grapes of wrath and look at that. Look at the consequences of soil loss on a greater society. Look at all this like really boring little films about earthworms, you know, stuff like that, to really try to understand what that world of the story is. So I'm going from Hollywood all the way down into the most technically geeky kinds of things. That's part of my research. I want to know the world that I'm in. And the great story teacher, Robert McKee, who gives great seminars, if you're ever in Los Angeles and LA, he's teaching there, I highly recommend it. He says, you have to be like a god in the world that you're making that film. Otherwise, you're going to repeat cliches over and over and over again. So that's a very important part of research. Research can also bring you into libraries, into your neighborhood, into attics, in historical societies, all kinds of things, depending on what you're doing. If you're doing a film on sports, you may have to go out and jump off the mountain on these parasailers too, to understand what it is that these athletes are experiencing. So it's kind of fun. When we get our story, then we will do what's called a proposal because we have to raise money to make ours. A lot of people don't. They self-fund their documentaries, which is sometimes the only way certain things get done. It's very helpful to have married well or to be from a wealthy family, but short of that, it can be very helpful to have a lot of wealthy friends, or if you have huge social networks, you can crowdfund through Kickstarter and some of these other kinds of websites now. But so we will fundraise through more conventional kinds of means, through different foundations, maybe through television stations that are putting out a call on certain programs. So for that, we write up a proposal, and it's usually a one-page synopsis of what the issue is, because again, we're doing issue-oriented documentaries. That may not be your thing, but that's how we will do it. What is the problem? How will this particular documentary really talk about it? Then what a treatment is when somebody says, oh, I really like your idea, then, well, this is what we would do in the old days. Nowadays, you probably go out and you try to cut a trailer and get simple kind of, if you have the money to go out into the field and get stuff. Like, we've done a few films in South America in the Amazon, so in general, it's too expensive to go to the Amazon to get a little bit of footage, to cut a trailer, to come back. So we'll write a treatment, which is a much more involved kind of description. So if you're doing that kind of documentary, you want to try to picture in your mind what it might be like to do that story, who you might talk to, what it could look like, what's some of the things we might actually see, what are some of the scenes. This is all, it's a bit like a very, very rough map that you're drawing on the back of a napkin, because generally real life will thwart your expectations every single time. So you might write this very involved treatment, and then you get there and it's like, it's a whole other world. We had gone to, I'm using a lot of examples from this one particular film we did in the Amazon called The Shaman's Apprentice, because I happen to have a lot of pieces of it here that I can show and demonstrate. I had written a very complex treatment, and part of it was involved in going to this place. I mean, it took a long time to get there because there's no roads. You can only fly there. You can't even float in there because it's so remote in the Amazon. And it was based around this particular shaman called the Jaguar Shaman, who our lead character had studied with and all this stuff. So we get at enormous expense, very difficult, all the way into this place in the Amazon. And I'm looking around and I'm going, so, where's the Jaguar Shaman? We would love to meet him. And one of the Indians said, well, we don't know, he wandered off about 2 years ago, he's probably dead. So I'm like, oh my God, now what do we do? So, you run around and we did lots of other things to try to stick to the storyline that I thought about, but it wasn't quite the same. And then meanwhile, the Indians went, and I don't know how they do it. I mean, we're talking people who are 300 miles from the closest airstrip, aside from one of their village. So you have to fly 300 miles over the jungle to get there. They somehow found that he was living about 200 miles upstream in Brazil. And I don't know how they did that. I don't know how they figured it out. And we were only in this village for 5 days. And on the last day, we were filming this thing, and the Jaguar Shaman walked in. So they had somehow found him. They somehow found enough gasoline to power a boat to go all the way to Brazil. Then they figured out how to persuade him to come back to this village that he had left 2 years before. So, we were lucky. We were really lucky that we found him, but it could have been a very different film than the one we made. So, like I say, when you're doing a treatment, you're kind of, you're drawing that little map on the back of the napkin, and that thing will change, because sometimes stories will go wander off, and they'll go wander through the woods, and then come back and meet you at the end of the project, and you don't know what just happened to you. But that can often happen. But the more you are mentally prepared to do things, and I don't mean to be rigid to say, oh no, we have to do this, because that makes it for a dead film. But if you have more mental preparation and like that God in your world, you will be able to create something that people will remember, really remember, and really touch them. So and I'll just continue on this a little more. We'll get into some more just pretty stuff in a minute. We have found over time that doing a documentary, when you're doing it about any kind of story, really, the way into your story is most often through a person or through people. And we made early mistakes where we would go out and we'd start a film and we would shoot go find everybody and interview them and hear what they had to say, and at the end of 6 months you come back and you go, all it is just a bunch of talking heads, and we ended up spending all this money and we're just having conversations with people, and this is a novice mistake, and very often you will blow your budget that way. And I have known people who have blown as much as $1 million, and all they have is a bunch of interviews. and then what they call B-roll. Well, it's not B-roll, I'm sorry. Like, all the visual sort of stuff is your A-roll. It's really important because film is a visual medium. And the old days of documentary, people couldn't talk on camera. Even once they had sound, sync sound was so difficult, we did not really have people talking on camera through a whole film until after 1960. So all the early documentaries were all scenes. They were all action. Did anybody here see Hugo, the Martin Scorsese's picture? I mean, it's a wonderful film. I mean, I ignore a lot of this stuff, but he has a whole sequence about the early days of filmmaking. And Georges Méliès, they have all this stuff at this library here, by the way, and they'll sometimes do programs on Georges Méliès, the early days of filmmaking, and these beautiful films that were made and mostly lost. There's wonderful sequences in there on what the first films were like. They were all documentaries. They didn't do fiction for the longest time. So the reels were only about a minute long for a film reel. So they would show things like they show in Hugo, people leaving a factory, or a train coming into the station, or a woman feeding a baby. And then real documentaries were born in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, and they said, oh cool, let's do reenactments literally in a giant swimming pool in New Jersey, pretending to be a battle for Cuba, and the little boats in there, all reenactments and stuff. So that's when film started to become, they started thinking, oh yeah, these are more interesting uses of it. So all those things, documentaries, people didn't talk in. They'd have to have a narrator, generally, the voice of God kind of thing. If you think of the March of the Penguins, not like penguins can talk. So they had a narrator in there. So don't waste your time with a huge number of interviews. And if you don't know who's going to be a good character, we do what we call pre-interviews. Because sometimes you have to look for a person who's going to be good on camera, right? Like, I went and I talked to a scientist at Cornell who was the absolute top of his field, a very handsome man, incredibly articulate. I don't know, it was totally fascinating. And then eventually the crew caught up with me, we came and we set it up and we put the camera on, and all of a sudden he couldn't put two words together. And the camera made him tongue-tied. And we were out of a 2-hour interview with him, we were able to get maybe 2 statements that we could cut into the film that were reasonably articulate. And it was such a dramatic difference between the man in back of the camera and the man in front of the camera. So you have to understand that cameras, even though they're completely ubiquitous in our lives, can make people very nervous or change them. They may get stiff, their voices might go funny on them. Most people are terribly afraid of public speaking. I mean, it's worse for them than going to the dentist or dying. So a camera is like a form of public speaking. So what we do are pre-interviews where you don't spend a whole lot of money. You could just take your little handheld camera, or now with an iPhone, things like that, and just go out and identify different people that you might want to talk to, and just take them, and don't spend a lot of money, and see who might be good on camera and who's not, before you blow the money on more expensive kinds of shoots. That's what we'll do. And that way you may be able to identify people who you didn't quite expect to be all that good. I mean, in some cases, you want to talk to a lot of people. Like I just saw last night, Beware of Mr. Baker. And it's really quite marvelous. It's very adrenaline-fueled. And he talks to a lot of people. But all the people were very used to being in the public eye, like Johnny Rotten and Eric Clapton, all these sort of characters who are not uncomfortable in front of the camera. But your average, ordinary citizen, who is not a child, can be very nervous about it. Now, the reason I say this is because we have found over time that even if we're telling a story on a very, very complex subject, a single character can help guide you through it. And this is who we are as humans. We're pattern-seeking organisms. So a single person will help us to follow a story because we relate to them. And we want to find a character that we really do like, right? And it doesn't have to be a perfect character because nobody loves perfection, really. We love each other because of our imperfections. So that's why we'll do pre-interviews, so that we can really get that. And if you can do it, like I say, sometimes you just have to pick up the camera and go. Now, film, this is the other thing, besides the fact that you're going to have to be really organized, whether it comes natural to you or not, or find a partner who is really organized and work with that partner, because there's a lot of work to do in documentary. It's nice if you share it. The other thing, that if you don't remember anything else from today, remember film is a visual medium. It's a visual medium. Even if you have a great story, you have to look at it really hard and say, can I tell this in pictures? Can I do it? Is it going to be better off as a film, or is it going to be better off as a magazine article, or a book, a novel, a song, a poem, a painting? It doesn't matter. Why do you want to make a film about a particular subject?
Hi, my name is Rachel Ramberg, reporting for Boulder Community Media. We are here at Boulder's Public Library with Abby Wright, who just finished instructing her workshop on how to produce a documentary. So Abby, what is a common mistake that you see documentarians that are just starting out make?
They forget that film is a visual medium. And so sometimes their projects would be better as books or magazine articles. They don't think through how they're going to tell the story in pictures. That's the most common mistake.
Okay, thank you. So with documentaries, they can tend to have the stigma of being boring. What is a way that filmmakers can avoid this and make their work more interesting and more memorable?
Yes, don't be boring. Nobody will watch it. Well, there are a couple of factors involved. One of them is length. A lot of documentaries are too long. Part of that's because we started showing them theatrically, and in order to show them theatrically, they have to be at least 70 minutes long. But a lot of stories can be told a lot shorter than that, in 50 minutes maybe. So, you have to be really brutal with your information in order to just have the most basic information in your documentary. Second of all is, having a really good sense of humor helps. So you can find all the places where you might give people a chance to relax and to laugh. You want to have a really good visual style so that people can really get lost in the pictures and in the music. And also it's simple. I think Albert Einstein said, if it's not simple, you don't understand it well enough. So you want to make the information clear to everybody. Those are all factors which will hopefully keep your documentary from being really boring, and that in a really good subject.
Okay, great. One last question for you. So during your workshop, you brought up the quote of how artists are the gatekeepers to the truth and how artists are also the radical voice of society. What kind of responsibilities come with that role, and where do you see that role, especially in filmmaking, taking off in the future?
Wow. Thanks for remembering that, Rachel. No, that's really good. I think what I'd like to remind people is that what they do with film is probably the most powerful medium we have now. It gets directly through to people's hearts and minds because of the power of the sound, the music, the image. So there's a lot of responsibility in that. You want to be really clear on the message you want to say and how you're saying it. Otherwise, you might as well be producing a circus. Send some lions out, kill the gladiators, chew up some Christians, otherwise that's what it is. And like I say, a lot of feature film, they'll just throw sex and violence into something because they don't have a good enough plot. So I don't believe that. If you want to call yourself an artist rather than, a circus master, then you have to take that role seriously.
Okay, well, thank you so much for answering our questions. We appreciate it.